Huh? Oh.
Hi, my name is Dr. Ramesh Laungani, and I'm chair of the science department at Poly Prep Country Day School in Brooklyn, New York. I'm really excited to be part of this year's Sci-Pop Talks. Today, I'll be talking to you about a really exciting topic in biology and in science overall. And in order to help you understand this topic, we're going to talk about some really cool things, specifically Ents and Groot. And we're going to be answering the question whether or not trees can talk. If you want to know more about me or my science, you could find me on Twitter at Dr. Ram Bio. I thought this was a particularly fitting topic because recently the new Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power series have come up, and the new Marvel Studios series, I Am Groot, has been released. So I thought this was particularly fitting to answer the question, can trees talk to each other? As we know, in both the Lord of the Rings series and as you can sort of see in this little graphic, there's a lot of potential for talking trees in both of these. But there's actually been a long history of talking trees in film. So when I was born in the 1980s, this was one of the first movies I saw, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, where talking trees were shown.
Smile. You'll know this old world is a great world after all. Smile, smile, yes, smile. Things are never black as they are pale.
All right, that was quite a bit. Watching that clip now, I don't know how I watched that as a kid, but you could see those trees were really excited and they were talking. But there's been even a longer history of talking trees in film. Very famously in The Wizard of Oz, back in 1939.
Oh, apples! Oh, look! Oh. Ouch!
What do you think you're doing?
We've been walking a long ways and I was hungry and... Did you say something?
She was hungry.
She was hungry.
Well, how would you like to have someone come along and pick something off of you?
What we're going to do today is we're going to talk about two more recent modern examples of talking trees in film to help you understand how plants communicate and whether they can, in fact, talk to each other. We'll use the example of Ents and Groot. So let's start with Ents. So Ents are a race of beings from the J.R.R. Tolkien fantasy novels, The Lord of the Rings. They reside in Middle-earth and they closely resemble trees. And their name supposedly is derived from the Anglo-Saxon word for giant. And so, you know, I think there's some debate about whether they actually are trees or not, but they look really closely to trees. So when I watched the movies and when I read the books, I saw them as talking trees. Here's a little taste of what they do.
But you must understand, young hobbit, it takes a long time to say anything in old Entish, and we never say anything unless it is worth taking a long time to say.
Now let's talk about Groot. What is Groot? Groot is a Marvel superhero from the MCU. He's a sentient tree-like creature, and he appeared originally as an invader that intended to capture humans for experimentation. Groot has this really amazing ability. He can absorb wood as food, and he has the ability to regenerate. He can control other trees. He can take the form of plants, using them to attack others, and he appears to be resistant to fire, something that not all trees are. Most trees aren't resistant to. Groot, like a tree, is able to sprout dramatically, increasing his mass, but it also severely inhibits his movement. But what's really interesting in this talk about Groot is the way he uses language. And to understand his language, we have to sort of understand where Groot is coming from. Groot is from a planet known as Flora Colossus, is a species Flora Colossus from planet X. And he uses this phrase, "I am Groot." And that's the only thing he can say. Here's an example of how he uses that phrase in a lot of different ways to convey a lot of different ideas.
I am Groot. 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 I am Groot.
So the question is, now that we've seen Ents talk to each other and we've seen Groot express all these different emotions with just a simple phrase, as we started off this talk, the real question is, so can trees and other plants really talk to each other? And the answer is sort of. And the way they do that is by using something called volatile airborne signals, or VOCs, which are called volatile organic compounds. And some plants can release VOCs when they're damaged. So what I want you to look at here in the figure is you have a plant, and imagine it undergoes some form of damage, either clipping or an herbivore like an insect chews on its leaf, or maybe there's an infection. What happens is that plant releases a volatile organic compound. Almost think of it like a pheromone or an odor. And that volatile organic compound can be released from the site of the damage, signaling to other parts of the same plant that this damage or this infection is occurring. And so those VOCs can sort of be, quote unquote, heard by other leaves and other branches on that plant. And it can also be heard, quote unquote, by other plants nearby. So VOCs aren't just a self-defense mechanism. They can actually be a defense mechanism for other plants in the area. So when another plant in the area sort of senses those VOCs in the air, it turns up its direct defenses, it maybe turns up hormones, maybe it turns on some genes that increase pathogen resistance. So these VOCs are really an airborne signal to help other plants and other parts of the individual sort of sound the alarm that there is this damage, that there is this sort of enemy on the march. And what's really amazing is that these VOCs come in all these different forms. I almost like to think of this like diverse chemical vocabulary that can be used by different plants to sort of signal different things, and different species use different combinations of VOCs. So what you see in front of you here, the individual names aren't critically important, but what I want you to notice is that there are all these different types of words, all these different types of VOCs, all these different types of chemicals that are being used to communicate between plants. Just like we use a diverse vocabulary to communicate a vast array of ideas, VOCs are similarly just as diverse. What you're seeing here is just a small sampling of some VOCs that exist out there in the world. So you've probably experienced some VOCs if you've ever smelled freshly cut grass. In fact, many people, myself included, love the smell of freshly cut grass. Well, in fact, what you love is VOCs. What you love is grass screaming to their neighbors that we just got the tops of our bodies chopped off. So that's what you're smelling when you're smelling freshly cut grass. You're smelling grass VOCs. And there's a way to actually test this experimentally, not just by running a lawnmower over a lawn and saying, do I smell something different? We can actually test how VOCs work experimentally. So in this experiment that I'm going to explain, there's a plant called sagebrush. And what the researchers did is they clipped a little piece of the sagebrush off. And they took some measurements of other sagebrush in the area. So what they did is they had a sagebrush in one. If you just look at the top, they had two plants. They had a plant nearby sort of a wind source as highlighted by that cloud, and they had a downwind plant. And then if you look at the bottom row, they had a similar plant, but they clipped a leaf or clipped a few leaves on that plant, and again, sort of forced some air. And they were looking at the downwind plants from both the clipped on the bottom and the unclipped on the top. So again, the key focus here is not, in fact, the plant that was clipped. It's actually the downwind plant. Basically, they're trying to figure out, these researchers are trying to figure out, can this clipped plant, through the release of VOCs, signal a downwind plant? That was the hypothesis that they were testing. And so here's a graph. And before I show you the results, let's orient ourselves with the graph. So again, what they were doing is they were collecting their data in the downwind plant. So not the one that was clipped or unclipped, not the one near the cloud. They were looking at the ones further down from the cloud. And what they did is they looked at the average number of leaves that were damaged by maybe an insect further, either 0 to 20 centimeters away from the plant, 21 to 60 centimeters, and more than 60 centimeters away from either the clipped or unclipped plant. And what you'll find, what's really, really interesting, is that just downwind of the plant that was clipped, there was significantly less damage compared to the plant that was downwind of the unclipped plant. We actually see the same pattern in 21 to 60 centimeters. And now over 60 centimeters, maybe the signal was sort of lost in the wind. And so the downwind plant that was more than 60 centimeters sort of didn't, quote unquote, hear the VOCs. But as you can see, the downwind plant from the clipped plant clearly had less damage. And what they found in other parts of the study was that this was driven by an increase in defensive compounds produced by the downwind plant that was downwind of the clipped plant. Another really, really cool study is one where researchers took a leaf and they put a certain species of caterpillar on that leaf, and they let that caterpillar chew that leaf up, take a couple of bites out of it. And what that leaf did is it released a particular VOC here. And what was really, really cool, every time I talk about this study, I just think it's cooler and cooler. What this VOC does is it actually attracts a wasp that then attacks the caterpillar. How cool is that? That is literally like signaling the cavalry when this attack happens. Now, what was really interesting was not only that this happens, like the leaf can literally put out smells into the world that attract this predatory wasp, but what they did is they then tried this with just by damaging the leaf with a hole puncher. So they put the hole puncher, they took the leaf, they put a few hole punches in it. And what was really interesting is the defensive compound wasn't sent out, and therefore the predatory wasp didn't show up. So there's something specific about the saliva of a caterpillar or the bite of a caterpillar that can actually trigger a very specific response from the plant, and therefore in turn trigger a very specific predatory wasp to come in and attack that caterpillar, that herbivore. I mean, this is sort of, like I said, every time I see this, I'm blown away by how amazing these plants can be and the way they use these VOCs to communicate. What's even cooler is that this communication is not just above ground. It's not just in the leaves. So plants, you see what's above ground, the leaves and the stems and the flowers and the fruits, but underneath there's a huge network of roots, and attached to that network of roots is an even bigger network of fungi that are associated with all those roots. And those fungal networks function as plant-plant underground communication conduits, and they actually even help transfer nutrients between trees. Now, what's really interesting is they've even been shown to share disease resistance between healthy and pathogen infected plants. So this is how trees possibly can talk underground. They sort of share an underground brain. So let's see how an experiment can test this. So what some researchers did is they were just testing below ground communication specifically. So what's the talking happening underground? And so what they did is they put the plant on the left here. They put sort of a mesh around it that wouldn't allow any VOCs to be transferred, and they infected that plant with this A. solani, which is a plant pathogen in this case. And there was a plant to the right, and the researchers allowed fungal connections to occur between the two plants. They also had an identical setup where they didn't allow those fungal connections to occur between the two plants. So can you guess what happened? Well, in the plants that had the fungal connections, there were defensive compounds were produced more significantly in the plant that was uninfected by that A. solani, so the plant on the right, where fungal connections were present, the defensive compounds were much, much higher. Where there were no fungal compounds or no fungal connections made, there were no defensive compounds made in the plant, in the uninfected plant. So again, what we can see here is that plants can really communicate quite a lot to each other to ensure that other members of their group, other neighbors, are protected. So if you have these fungal messaging systems that allow neighbor plants to invoke herbivore defenses before the herbivore attacks, which I think is pretty amazing. Now, what don't we know? What's left to understand? Talked to you about VOCs. I talked to you about these really cool experiments of roots underground. Well, we don't know the full vocabulary of these plants. Do they use single words like Groot? Or do they have this really, really hyper diverse vocabulary that they can use in different combinations? Well, we have some indication that they do that, but we don't have the full dictionary of plant words that they use to communicate. So the question I started off with today is, can trees talk to each other? And the answer is a resounding yes. These are just some resources of many of the studies that I shared with you today. Thank you so much. I hope that you learned something. I hope that you enjoyed the talk. And I hope that now when you watch Lord of the Rings or when you watch Guardians of the Galaxy, you watch it with a renewed and more enthusiastic sense of curiosity and science about how those plants, how those Ents, and how Groot communicate with the world around them. Thanks so much for taking part in this talk. It was so fun. I hope you learned something about plants. I hope you learned something about trees. I hope you learned some really cool science. And I hope that you just stay curious and keep asking questions like, can trees talk to each other? And maybe you'll be the one to figure out the diverse vocabulary of trees. Thanks so much.